Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Smith, and thanks so much for joining in to this little bit more advanced session on MYP unit planning. It's geared particularly for MYP coordinators, but if you have some years of experience in MYP unit planning, this might be a great session for you as well. So before we get started, just so that you understand the background of my perspective that I'm coming from in this session, I wanted to go over that just a little bit.
I've been involved in education for over 25 years. Actually, I feel like it's more like my entire life since both of my parents were teachers. But I've been involved in the MYP for about going on 18 years. And in addition to 13 years as an MYP coordinator, I've also been involved in many different IB educator network roles. I was a part of the team that first developed the Building Quality Curriculum Service, and I've been a senior reviewer ever since. So I'm also part of a team that has developed exemplar units in each subject group and other teacher support materials that will soon be published on my IB. So my perspective is all about helping teachers and coordinators get clarity in unit planning in terms of the expectations of building quality curriculum, and hopefully in much more specificity than can be found in the guides. You may be familiar with the videos on my YouTube channel about different aspects of the MYP, including unit planning and assessment. And I also wanted to make sure that you're aware of the series of MYP unit planning videos that were just published on my IB. These are brief animated videos that provide really clear guidance and an example of each section of a unit plan. They're available in English, French, and Spanish, and they're on the Program Resource Center in the Middle Years Program, General Materials section under MYP Unit Planning. Also, before we get started, I wanted to recognize that in our current circumstances, I'm sure that units and unit planning are a bit up in the air for your teaching teams. With at-home learning, blended learning, or in-person socially distanced learning, many aspects of existing unit plans need to be adjusted or maybe just started over. So I wanted to say up front that the focus of this session is not intended to address or provide ideas for adapting unit plans in response to these circumstances. That would be a great session, but this session is intended to provide coordinators with an in-depth look at the MYP unit planning process, what goes where in the unit plan, what the expectations are as expressed in this document, Evaluating MYP Unit Plans, and this is what informs the feedback that is received in Building Quality Curriculum. Since this is a recorded go-at-your-own-pace session, I won't be pausing for interaction or application of the ideas. So if you would like to consider one of your own unit plans or one of your teacher's unit plans in light of the guidance provided, it can be helpful to pause the video to identify the strengths and/or areas for further development in a particular section of that unit plan compared to the examples provided. So let's get started. Something that all coordinators face is how to balance the need for unit plan development and improvement and the challenges of meeting teachers' training needs, the problem of helping teachers find and effectively use their planning time, and possibly different forms of resistance to unit planning. Maybe resistance to the MYP in general, or to unit planning in general, or to coaching from you and or the subject group lead or head of department. Many reasons why teachers might be resistant or reluctant to participate in unit plan development. Even in normal times, finding this balance can sometimes seem overwhelming, with the challenges to effective unit planning sometimes overpowering the benefits and requirements. But based on our own experience, we know that understanding the MYP is a journey, a winding journey, and we often find that the unit planning part of that journey might not be as imagined by some of our teachers or even by ourselves. Some teachers, especially teachers who are experienced in non-MYP educational settings, might anticipate a brief learning period, but are fairly confident that with just a few adjustments, they will soon complete the unit planning process based on their past experience. But the reality of that journey can be very different. There can definitely be excitement and success in developing excellent units, but there can also be detours and trip ups and exhaustion. And there may be times when teachers just step away from the journey, frustrated, mad, or depressed. As coordinators, we may find ourselves shifting between being really enthusiastic, we can do it, yeah, or shifting over to we have to do it and feeling kind of like we're forcing something on the teachers. In fact, we really have to juggle a lot of roles. Coordinators have to be coaches, cheerleaders, taskmasters, sometimes therapists, the liaison with the administration, the liaison with the IB, and many coordinators are also teachers. So, in addition to all the responsibilities that teaching brings, this role as a colleague and a friend to members of the MYP team sometimes brings additional challenges to their role as coordinators. So let's look at some ideas for finding balance in this really challenging job. So I think we've learned even more critically during this period of COVID that health and well-being are the foundation for everything else. So even if you have an evaluation visit approaching and you feel the pressure of so many other priorities, let's just think about a few of the priorities you might be thinking about. You've got concept-based teaching and learning. You've got your content, scope, and pacing guides to develop. You want to further develop the assessment so that it's more effective and practical and helpful for students. You've got differentiation to think about, ATL skills development, as well as unit planning. So even with all these, it is the health and well-being of the school community that needs to be the first priority. And all the other elements will just need to improve over time. It's hard to be patient, but we've got to keep that health and well-being at the foundation. As long as you have a realistic plan for improvement and you've started taking steps in that plan, you'll be fine, even in your evaluation visit. With that in mind, a big part of MYP stress is often around unit planning. So we are going to try to get some clarity around that in this session. A first step in that process is to just take stock and some questions to get very, very clear about. One of the questions is, at your school, what is the general mood about unit planning? Just take a moment to think for yourself, or if you're watching this with others, you may want to pause the video and discuss your perceptions of the faculty mood or morale around unit planning. Take a moment to think. Are the majority of your teachers upbeat about unit planning, energized? They take independent initiative to learn and make progress? Are the majority of your teachers willing to do the work but may feel overwhelmed or say they don't have time? Very common. Do you have some teachers who are hesitant or confused about unit planning? Do you have teachers that can be actively resistant to unit planning? You might have a mix of all of those types of responses to this task, which is admittedly time-consuming and it takes a lot of thought and effort. But just like all learners, each teacher and subject team may need a different type of support. Enthusiastic self-starters might be excellent mentors to others. They might benefit from advanced training so they can spread understanding in an enthusiastic way. Many teachers may just need additional planning time built into the schedule, and this may require working with administrators to help them understand the extensive time required for effective unit planning and collaboration. And all teachers could benefit from professional development, question and answer opportunities, seeing exemplar unit plans. Keeping in mind that unit planning is a requirement, so there's no getting around that. So support and planning time really are the only way forward if progress is to be made. The next question to consider when you're taking stock of where you are currently is to consider your own level of experience and understanding. If you're very experienced, you may want to become an IB Educator Network member or a building quality curriculum reviewer. Reviewing units can be the best possible PD for gaining understanding. If you are you're at a using level, you're experienced, you understand the basics, but you still have a few specific questions. Or if you feel like you're at a developing level, you have some experience, you've maybe planned units yourself, but you still have many questions, the next step might be to find a way to get those questions answered. Very specifically, find a mentor, attend a training, reread the materials on MyIB, ask questions to IB Answers. Lots of avenues to take to try to get that clarity that you need. Or if you're at the beginning level, you're fairly new to MYP unit planning, you're not really even sure what you don't know yet, or you haven't written a unit plan in a while, it may be a great idea to try writing an exemplar unit to use in professional development with your teachers, or collaborate with an open-minded teacher to develop his or her unit plan. Another step that can be really helpful is to outline a very clear plan that extends across a few years, so that rather than feeling panicky about all the units and all the different areas of MYP that need to be developed, having a plan can really help to ease anxiety and overwhelm and give you a step-by-step process for getting there. The great news is that you've already started on the first step of a possible plan, because one of the most important things you can do is to clarify the basics of MYP unit planning for yourself. This will help you envision where you and your team are heading, and some ideas beyond this session might be to watch the MYP unit planning series on the Program Resource Center that I talked about previously, to really get to know the descriptors in the publication evaluating MYP unit plans, and to really dive into the resources on the Program Resource Center, and then get very, very specific about the areas of your team's unit plans that need further development. If you've submitted units to BQC, really analyze that feedback, particularly the comments, and try to understand what they mean in terms of the descriptors in evaluating MYP unit plans. Possibly review one unit plan per teacher yourself to get a clear feel for each teacher's individual needs. Another great idea is to organize the unit planning resources in one easily accessible online spot. There are a lot of guides that can be helpful, and sometimes a roadblock to getting organized in terms of even starting developing unit plans or revising unit plans is just getting all of the resources together, the most helpful resources. So organizing one spot where they can all be found can be really helpful. Another idea is to survey your MYP team, get them involved, find out their needs. Some sample questions might be, what questions do you have about MYP unit planning? What elements of unit planning are the most challenging for you? What would be most helpful for you in order to further develop your unit plans? Do you need training? If so, what kind? IB training, targeted subject group training, one-on-one support, BQC feedback analysis? Do you need resources? For example, what kind of resources? Units, exemplar units, annotated unit planners, videos, what would be helpful? Or do you just need planning time? And if so, what kind of planning time? In subject group teams, with the coordinator, by yourself? What is needed? Once you've found out your teacher's needs, some other ideas might be to plan out a series of MYP unit planning professional development opportunities in a variety of formats. For example, during scheduled MYP meeting times, or short voluntary sessions during lunch, even providing lunch. That's always a great incentive. Maybe retreat days in subject group teams, or full MYP retreat days, professional development days. Maybe if you had a menu of options of online self-accessed PD resources, that might be a way to approach growth and development. And of course, as time and budget allows, IB workshop attendance is always a good idea. Then, to address the need for planning time, it's great to plan and post a schedule of planning time that is set aside for specific needs. For example, unit planning, ATL development and discussion, IDU development and discussion. But if it's specifically for unit planning, even getting more specific and having this calendar or this outline of when this is going to happen so that it's predictable. It could be a time to develop existing unit plans or to develop new units or to discuss IDU development. Once the teachers understand what they need to develop, they can, on their own or in subject group teams, identify realistic goals for ongoing unit plan development and revision. It may be helpful for subject group teams to keep a record of their progress and for each teacher to identify a completion goal for each planning period. Because we know that unit planning is a journey and it's long and it almost never ends. So it's important to recognize and share and celebrate even small accomplishments along the way. So today we're going to jump right into that first step of the action plan and clarify the basics of unit planning. We're going to focus in on the statement of inquiry. That's the guiding light of every unit. Sometimes it's a source of a lot of confusion, so we're going to focus on that. Then we're going to get some clarity about the unit's inquiry questions. And finally, we're going to take a look through at a complete sharing level unit plan so we can just see what a sharing level unit plan might look like. So starting with the statement of inquiry, we know that this statement is critical to MYP unit planning. And we also know that it needs to include a key concept and one or more related concepts. It also needs to reference a real-world context for the unit's inquiries. We're going to look at this in more detail and consider some examples, but first it may be helpful to take a look at some of the most common issues that we see in units submitted to the Building Quality Curriculum Service. See if you recognize any of these issues. The statement of inquiry does not include the unit's identified concepts. It does not include a global context exploration. It does not express an active relationship between the concepts. It doesn't make much sense, or it doesn't have much relevance to the learning that goes on in the unit, even though it's written in the unit plan. Some of these problems might have originated because of this equation, which is sometimes presented in MYP workshops. Have you seen or heard of this before? Does it look familiar? Well, let's look at the type of statements of inquiry that are often generated using this formula. These are from actual units submitted to BQC. I'm just going to put them up and have you try to understand what they're trying to express. So you can see that these examples, even though they follow the so-called formula, they really don't have any meaning. They're sort of awkward and who knows what they're trying to say. It's one of those formulaic kind of statements. So something to consider is that even if this formula is used as well as possible, unlike the four we just looked at, even if it's used well, it still would not, or it may not, create a statement of inquiry that reflects a sharing level in evaluating MYP unit plans and BQC. So let's look at 4 examples that have much more meaning than the 4 we just looked at. However, we're going to look at why they, even though they follow the formula, would not achieve or they would not demonstrate the sharing level. So there's some clear strengths in these examples. There's key concepts, related concepts. There are global context explorations. No, there's no exploration. Sorry, they just have the global context category, which is one of the main issues with these statements. So we need to find a different way to envision what goes into an effective sharing level statement of inquiry. Not that mathematical plus 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 equals equation. So first of all, the key and related concepts are not just words to be added into a sentence like 1 plus 1. So the plus sign is not really useful. There needs to be an important relationship expressed between the concepts. So this double arrow symbol might better describe the idea of relationship. Second, we need to think about the key and related concepts as a set. There's a standalone relationship between them. And then there are two important points to remember about the global context. It is the exploration that needs to be included in the statement of inquiry. The exploration needs to frame the unit, not the global context category. And again, the exploration is not just another word added into the sentence. So the statement of inquiry needs to describe the relationship between the key and related concepts and include a global context exploration through which that idea and the unit content will be explored in the unit. To clarify further, the relationship between the key and related concepts is the conceptual understanding part of the statement of inquiry. Now, developing a conceptual understanding is not a requirement, but it makes it so much clearer that I would recommend it. So you're going to have the conceptual understanding, and then you're going to have the global context exploration included in the statement of inquiry. And the global context exploration is the authentic setting, situation, application through which students are going to explore the exploration. They're going to explore the conceptual idea and the subject group content. As just a little side note, you may be wondering about the color coding of the key concept in red, the related concept in blue, and the global context and exploration in green. Well, they're white on the screen, but the background's green. And this is also represented and presented in MYP workshops, and it's a way to keep track of the involvement of the concepts and the context throughout the unit plan. It's not required, but again, I would highly recommend it just to keep track of how authentically you are incorporating these elements into your unit plan, into your teaching and learning. So you're going to see more examples of this throughout the session. So something that seems daunting often is where to begin in developing a unit and a statement of inquiry. There's many places to begin. You don't need to start at the beginning and make your way sequentially through the unit plan. Sometimes you need to get your mind around what the content is going to be and what the learning process is. And then you are sort of forming or weaving together the unit, going back and forth between the sections as you develop that connectivity and that unified approach that you're going to be developing the statement of inquiry throughout the entire unit plan and having students demonstrate their understanding of it in the summative task. So we're going to look at a couple places to begin, and one place that it would be great to begin, but may not be all that common. If your school has flexibility in designing the curriculum sequence in a subject group, it can be really powerful to start with considering the big conceptual ideas in each subject group that can really help students understand the way that the world works, how that subject group can inform understanding of how the world works. Subject group team can meet and they can start with a list of the subject's prescribed key concepts and related concepts and brainstorm. What are the connections between them? What relationships exist between them? How does one impact the other? For example, in individuals and societies, the team might consider these key concepts: change, global interactions, systems, and time, place, and space, all important key concepts in this subject group. The guide also notes that the key concepts culture, development, and communities are also among the key concepts that are important in this subject group. And keep in mind that the team doesn't need to only consider those. If some of these other key concepts are important and critical to helping students get a idea about the perspective of individuals and societies, you can use any of these concepts or create a customized concept if none of them quite fit a particular learning objective that you have. And because individuals and societies is a multidisciplinary subject group, there are a whole range of related concepts that can be considered. Clearly, all of these concepts are not going to be able to be explored in depth. So, keep scrolling. The teachers are going to need to look at the 5 years of the program and figure out which concept they are going to combine to come up with those critical and core conceptual ideas that this subject group can help students understand about the workings of the world. Sciences is another multidisciplinary subject, and there are going to be multiple types of related concepts that are going to be selected from. And keep in mind that teachers also have the option of considering related concepts from other subjects or customizing concepts that are important in framing the perspective of their subject. So the choice of concepts is very wide open, and if we want students to understand the conceptual constructs or perspectives of each subject at any level of depth, something I would recommend for all subjects, but for multidisciplinary subjects like individuals and societies and sciences in particular, would be to think about conceptual learning in terms of just defining a set of big ideas that the subject can contribute towards understanding the world and the ways of interacting in that world that can promote a better and more peaceful world. So let's just take a quick look at some examples that, for instance, an individuals and societies subject group team might come up with. The list of conceptual ideas that describe a meaningful relationship between the concepts. So here are just a few that the subject team might come up with. For example, culture shapes identity. This is an excellent example of a simple, powerful conceptual idea that could be explored over and over across the 5 years of the program. In terms of other related concepts can be incorporated as well, and in a range of different contexts. Such an important idea in individuals and societies that can help us understand how our culture shapes who we are. Some other ideas might be, let me just list off a few more, just as examples of the types of conceptual ideas that a subject team might just brainstorm as they're looking at the key and related concepts that their subject needs to help students explore in more depth. As a side note, remember that when expressing a conceptual understanding, the key and related concepts need to be clearly evident in the statements. They can be represented either explicitly, as they are in these examples, or they can be represented through clearly, words or phrases that clearly express the meaning of that concept, if that helps to express a more understandable and engaging idea. We just don't want to awkwardly throw together the actual words. If they make sense, then it's great to include them explicitly. It makes it clearer for students what concepts they are exploring. But in order to make it an understandable and engaging idea, you may want to replace at least one or more of those concept words with clearly representative words or phrases. After a full list has been brainstormed that includes each of the concepts prescribed for the subject group, the team could then select the ideas that could be most impactfully and relevantly explored. They could also identify a sequence of exploration across the 5 years of the program, including mapping out how specific concepts will be explored multiple times at increasing levels of depth and complexity. This mapping process is also critical to be able to help other teachers make conceptual connections across the subjects. Then, specific content topics, standards, and global context could be selected to help students explore these important big ideas. And with those elements, the statements of inquiry used to guide the units can be developed, followed by the rest of the units. This is an example of starting to think about units and statements of inquiry by first developing conceptual understandings. This isn't always possible, and we're going to look at another option if you have existing units or a mandated curriculum. In this case, if you have an existing curriculum or you have requirements, maybe you even have the order, the sequence in which learning needs to occur prescribed for you, you can start to develop meaningful statements of inquiry by beginning with the curriculum content. So let's just look at an example of this type of process using an MYP Arts music unit. Starting with the content outcomes, the teachers might begin by talking or listing out content, standards, and general ideas for the unit. They might collaborate with the whole arts team, with you, the MYP coordinator, or have an online brainstorming exchange with other teachers, or maybe just brainstorm on his or her own through free writing or mind mapping. So let's look at a pretend conversation. It's an MYP1 orchestra unit, and the teacher describes that she would like students to consider and explore how important it is to accurately read music notation, one of those very beginning music units. Another idea that he or she would like them to consider is how effective communication of that music piece requires accurate expression of the intended composition. Maybe she wants to take it a little bit deeper and to think about the composer that wrote that composition. So she would like them to think about the composition as more than just notes on a page, but as the expression of some message or feeling or sentiment that the composer had in mind. The next step in developing a statement of inquiry could be to analyze that conversation or written brainstorming of the content, maybe by highlighting the potential concepts that could be explored. So the first content area, it could be considered that reading music is a form of receptive communication. So the concept communication might be noted. The second area of content indicates that expression might be relevant, as well as composition. Additionally, since playing music is a form of productive communication, the concept communication might be noted again. So the teacher indicates the key concept communication and the related concepts composition and expression. Remember that the exact concept words might not always be present in the list of brainstorm content, but teachers should be able to recognize and identify relevant concepts that are at the foundation of that content. The next step could be to consider how a relationship between the identified concepts might be described. So they might come up with a conceptual understanding such as effective communication of a composition requires that the performer accurately expresses what is written, a very foundational idea in beginning music. But upon thinking further, maybe the teacher decides that she would like, or he or she would like to take the learning a bit deeper by also incorporating the composer's intentions, another entry point into the concept composition, so that she can have students consider what the composer might have been trying to express, an honoring of the composer in that composition they're playing. So he or she might come up with a slightly different conceptual idea. Effective communication of a composition requires accurate expression of the composer's intentions. So think about that. Is that important for students to understand? Is it transferable to other units, at least within the discipline of music? It is. It's also important to notice the verb. The verb requires creates an active relationship between the concepts. This is different than forms of the verb to be, which create a very static sentence. So if you want to create that active relationship between the concepts will be on either side of an active verb, a relationship verb that tells the impact or the connection or the relationship between the concepts in the statement. The next step would be for the teacher to think about what context could students use to meaningfully explore both the conceptual idea and the unit content of notation. So, in the MYP, teachers can consider the questions and descriptions of each global context in MYP from principles into practice. So let's just look at that real quick. So here we are in MYP from principles into practice in the descriptions of the global contexts. And we look at the focus questions and the descriptions. And we sort of think about, just at a general glance, which global context could be a relevant and engaging context through which to explore that conceptual idea and the unit content. So looking at this question, what is the nature and purpose of creative expression from the global context, personal and cultural expression? That seems to be to align with the inquiries of the unit. So personal and cultural expression might be selected. Then to clarify the context, to describe in more detail what the context of exploration is going to be, those are the parameters of the inquiries that will happen in the unit, we look over here at the possible explorations to develop. And remember, these are just examples. So this is not a prescriptive list. They are just ideas to inspire your own ideas. You can pick some ideas from here. You could pick a word or a couple words, or you could choose from different lists over here. You could combine any combination of words or phrases, or you could develop a customized exploration that aligns with the intentions or the focus area of this global context. So thinking about notation, this is what grabs my eye, is critical literacy. So perhaps part of that phrase could be identified as the exploration, perhaps literacy, that might be identified. So let's try it out. We have the conceptual understanding, and we maybe have picked the global context exploration literacy. So let's remember the elements that we're working with. We have the key concept, the related concepts, and maybe we're replacing composition with composer's intentions. And we've created the conceptual understanding. Effective communication of a music piece requires accurate expression of the composer's intentions. And we have the global context exploration literacy. So how might we combine those together in a meaningful, understandable statement? Take a quick moment to think about that, and then I'll add one idea. So here's one idea. Music literacy allows musicians to communicate effectively and accurately express the composer's intentions. So you see that it's okay to rearrange the conceptual understanding a bit, but it should still be evident within the statement of inquiry. It's not a whole new statement. You're using the conceptual understanding and you're adding in the global context exploration to clarify how that idea is going to be explored and why it's important. Why is that conceptual idea important in the world? Well, it's to have literacy, particularly in music. So just a quick note about transferability here. It is great if you have statements of inquiry that can transfer across subject groups. Important and necessary for interdisciplinary units. It's also wonderful to promote interdisciplinary understanding even without an interdisciplinary unit. However, The statement of inquiry, even if it's only transferable within the subject or discipline, that's fine. If it can be referred back to or used or adapted in other units within the subject group or discipline, the requirement for transferability has been met. So to review those steps and consider a different subject, let's look briefly at another example, this time from sciences. Again, the first step might be to start with the content outcomes. The teacher might begin by talking or listing out general content topics. And perhaps some students will be able to spot outcomes. Then the teacher might analyze those topics, and students will be able to phrases and find that some of them, systems is a key component, as well as the related concepts, energy, evidence, and transfer. So remember, this represents a very simplified process just for the sake of time, but it might involve looking at a longer process of looking at that content and really drawing out the key and related concepts that make the most sense in order to use that content to explore the concepts. Then the next step would be trying to combine those identified concepts into a conceptual understanding. And if they chose the key concept systems, the related concepts, energy, evidence, and transfer, they might come up with evidence can reveal energy transfer that occurs in a closed system. The next step would be to think about a context through which students could explore the conceptual understanding and the unit content. So we're looking at the conceptual idea and the content, just a little reminder. And we're thinking about what global context category might apply here. Looking at the category scientific and technical innovation, we see that the question is, how do we understand the world in which we live? So that question applies here to understanding chemical reactions. So that global context, scientific and technical innovation, might be selected. And within that context, we might select the exploration scientific method. That might be identified as a highly relevant context for inquiry throughout the unit. And we're going to combine those elements to form the statement of inquiry. So we're looking at the conceptual understanding and the global context exploration, and we might come up with a statement of inquiry such as evidence obtained through scientific methods can reveal energy transfer that occurs in a closed system. To just double check the statement of inquiry, some questions might be, are the key and related concepts and the global context exploration clearly evident in the statement of inquiry? Does the statement make sense? Can students understand it? Could it be transferable to another science unit? To other science units, they could revisit this at some point, bring it up again and say, what are we understanding now about evidence or about energy transfer or about scientific methods and systems? We can also look at it and think, is there an active relationship between the concepts? Is there an active verb? Reveal is an active verb that can create this connection between evidence. Evidence is used to reveal this important scientific phenomenon. So there is an active relationship expressed between the concepts. So take a moment to reflect on your understanding of how to develop a statement of inquiry. If you have specific questions based on what you've heard so far, you may want to pause the video and write them down. But we are going to now take a quick look at inquiry questions. There are three main points to remember about inquiry questions. The first one seems obvious, but oftentimes we don't see evidence of this in the units submitted to Building Quality Curriculum. So remember that the inquiry questions are intended to help students actually inquire into elements in the statement of inquiry. The units identified key and related concepts, the relationship between the concepts, and the global context exploration. So they are written to be used as prompts for specific learning experiences. So you're going to see those questions turn up again in the description of the learning process. How are those questions that you developed up in the inquiry section of the unit plan, how are they actually used to explore content and those conceptual ideas during the learning process? And the inquiry questions identified in this section of the unit plan do not include references to unit-specific content. So remember that the content-based questions can be identified in the learning experiences section. Every question identified in the inquiry section should help students understand and unpack each element in the statement of inquiry. So it should not include references to specific unit content. But content questions are important and highly encouraged. You just put them in the learning experiences section in terms of how they are used to prompt specific learning experiences. So let's look at some examples, how those 3 points are played out in examples from each subject group. Let's start with that arts music example that we started with. So the statement of inquiry is music literacy allows musicians to communicate effectively and accurately express the composer's intentions. So let's look at some questions that might be developed based on that statement of inquiry. Remember what you're looking for in the questions. Will the questions help students inquire into the key and related concepts and the relationship between them and the global context exploration? You can see how the color coding here really helps to clarify this. Could the questions be used as prompts for specific learning experiences? And check to make sure that the questions do not include references to any specific unit content. So for the rest of the examples, I'm just going to let you read through them, and then you'll be able to pause the video and access them again when this presentation is posted on the website. So in alphabetical order, here are some example questions from design. The statement of inquiry is innovative ideas for products and solutions often evolve through an iterative development process. We come up with some factual questions about those elements in the statement of inquiry. Some conceptual questions. And a debatable question. Next, individuals and societies. We have the statement of inquiry. Culture shapes beliefs and values that inform identity. Then language acquisition. Statement of inquiry, effective communication requires careful word choices in order to connect with and respect the customs and values of an audience. Think for a moment, what could those questions look like? And then language and literature. We have the statement of inquiry. Creative use of genre can inspire a personal style that conveys a unique interpretation of reality. And then mathematics. Statement of inquiry, models can reveal patterns of relationship between key variables in human impacts on the environment. Physical and health education. Perhaps a statement of inquiry such as lifestyle choices can impact the balance that systems need in order to regulate physical health and function optimally. And lastly, sciences. With the statement of inquiry, the energy distributed throughout a system can undergo a process of transfer from the system to the environment. So again, take a moment to reflect on your understanding of how to develop inquiry questions. If you have specific questions based on what you've heard so far, you may want to pause the video and write them down. Now we're going to spend the last half hour looking through an example of a full physical and health education unit plan that demonstrates the sharing level descriptors in evaluating MYP unit plans. This sample unit is of MYP 3. It's about 19 hours. And the key concept selected is change, the related concept adaptation, and the conceptual understanding that they came up with to combine those, to talk about the relationship between those two concepts is agile responses allow people to adapt quickly when circumstances change. It's understandable, it's meaningful, across PHE units and possibly other subjects as well. Then they selected the global context, identities, and relationships, and the exploration team, having to do with team membership and teamwork. So combining the conceptual understanding with the global context exploration, the statement of inquiry becomes agile responses by all team members allow the whole team to adapt quickly when circumstances change. Then we come down to the inquiry questions. Remember that they are drawn from and inspired by that statement of inquiry. So we're going to be looking for all three elements, the key concept, the related concept, and the global context exploration somewhere in these inquiry questions. So they come up with 2 factual questions. And I'll just let you read those. 3 conceptual questions. And a debatable question. So even just at first glance, you can see how this already is sort of scaffolding the learning, and you can imagine that specific learning experiences can be plugged in to help students explore each of those inquiry questions. We come down to the objectives, and they've only chosen 1 criterion and the strands within them. If it was a bit longer, I think that this unit plan might get the recommendation to incorporate other criteria so that there's a more active component, but we'll just see what is in this particular unit. So the outline of the summative assessment task, the name of the task, the criterion strands are going to be assessed through this task, and then a clear description of the task and how each criterion is going to be needing to be demonstrated within that task. So then the relationship between the summative assessment task and the statement of inquiry, again, this is where color coding can be helpful. They really need to describe how are those concepts going to be explored in the unit so that students can think about them and be able to demonstrate them within the summative task. The approaches to learning section, they're going to identify the skill category and the skill cluster, the specific skill indicator, and this phrasing is suggested in workshops where you're making the connection between what part of the unit is this particular skill indicator intended to support. So in this case, it is in order for students to, objective A1, describe physical and health education, and objective 2, they will need to create novel solutions to authentic problems. And then they describe the specific skill strategy that they are going to use to help students demonstrate this particular skill indicator. This is not a requirement identifying the strategy, but in my experience, it is what helps approaches to learning skills become practical and real and trackable. And so I would highly recommend that the skill strategies are also identified. In this particular unit, they're saying, where is this taught? It's in lesson 7, and we will see that show up again in the description of the learning experiences. So in this particular unit, 19 hours, they have identified 3 skill indicators. Here's the second one, and here's the third one. Each of them identifying, again, the skill category and cluster, the skill indicator, how that skill indicator is intended to support some aspect of the unit. In this case, again, it is an objective strand, and then the specific skill strategy that they are going to teach and support and provide feedback on. Here's an example of a skill indicator that is selected to support a particular part of the learning process. So there's 3 parts of the unit that you can consider when you're selecting approaches to learning skills. One is the objective strands. What types of skills might they need in order to do well to demonstrate those objective strands identified for the unit? The second is the learning experiences. What types of skills might they need in order to participate effectively in the unit's learning experiences? The third consideration, there's no example in this particular unit, but the third example would be some aspect of the summative task that is not maybe associated with one of the objectives. For instance, maybe they're giving a presentation, or they need to collaborate in order to complete the summative task. So they might need to have a specific approaches to learning skill in order to help them excel and achieve in the summative task. So again, 3 parts. You can have their approaches to learning skills support an objective strand, a specific learning experience, or a specific aspect of one of the unit's summative tasks. And we come down to the action section of the unit plan, and we come to the content. And if you have received feedback from Building Quality Curriculum, you may have gotten the comment, it may be helpful to organize this content section in terms of some categories. And in this case, identifying the prior knowledge that is applicable to this particular unit is always helpful. And then the factual knowledge, which might include the disciplinary topics, the terminology, certain vocabulary, categories or specific vocabulary, time periods, events, people, places, facts. The conceptual knowledge, which might include the disciplinary conceptual ideas such as models, theories, generalizations, principles. So oftentimes these are sentences. You can also see that some of the disciplinary conceptual ideas also have to do with the concepts. So it's very clear how the content is being used to explore the identified concepts. And then the fourth category could be procedural knowledge, which might include disciplinary skills, techniques, methods, procedures, things like that. So the learning experiences and teaching strategies, there are many ways to organize this. It's up to the school to identify how that's going to be described, but it does need to show what students do over the course of the unit and the order in which teaching and learning occurs. So it might be just considered like lesson plans. This particular unit has a lot of detail and would be very helpful if this unit was taught by multiple teachers. They know where they are, they're on the same page with what's being taught. Might be helpful for passing this unit on to the next teacher who is going to be teaching this particular course. So in this case, the teacher uses lesson by lesson. It could be week by week or topic by topic or inquiry question and then the next inquiry question. However you want to organize it in sequential order is fine. So you can see that this unit started out with an anticipatory set where students are getting engaged with the unit. They're starting out with a discussion and they're already getting into some of the concepts. Then the unit is introduces the statement of inquiry. Maybe they're asked to tap into prior knowledge about ideas within that statement of inquiry or what they just experienced so that they can already start thinking about that statement and how it's going to frame the unit. Then they go into each lesson. And you can see that it has like warm-ups. It includes where those inquiry questions are being addressed and explored. It says specifically what's happening and what type of teaching is happening. In here, this particular case, it's direct teaching. Then there's experiential learning. And this particular description also includes the homework. But it continues down, and I will just pause at each part so that you can see how much detail and what is included in the description of the learning process. Again, the statements, the inquiry questions are evident. Where the ATL skills are taught is evident. Where formative feedback happens is clearly outlined. They also have some of their differentiation methods. How is support and extension offered? How are more advanced students supported? Again, another ATL skills practice. And another inquiry question is used here. So in this case, it looks like they practice the approaches to learning skill strategies multiple times in different settings so that they're really getting practice and feedback in those approaches to learning skills. All right. I did want to point out that it does show where they are doing their summative task and how they are doing a final unit reflection. Then we come to the formative assessment, and again, it's sometimes helpful to organize this into categories. Those informal feedback types of formative assessment that are given, and these are the ongoing, in-the-moment types of formative assessment. So it's giving the teacher information on how students are doing, but it's also providing informal feedback to students so that they know where they are in their progress. Then we have the more formal formative tasks. So these are leading up into the summative task, and it identifies what criteria they are getting their feedback in terms of. So students will know where they are during the formative process, where they are in developing those objectives that they will need to demonstrate in the summative task and will be assessed in that summative with those summative criteria. We have the differentiation section. And again, building quality curriculum and evaluating MYP unit plans looks for differentiation in terms of content. That means the access, different ways that students will be able to access the content. The process, different ways that students will be able to process their learning. And then the product, mostly in terms of voice and choice. How will the summative task be differentiated to allow for different methods of expressing and demonstrating their summative learning. So this might be for all students. How is it differentiated for all students, but also particular students? So maybe they have learning needs, maybe they have language needs, and you're going to identify that here in this. Here's the language needs, and here's some ability level grouping, right? So although MYP uses the Universal Design for Learning, where there's many ways in which differentiated access to learning is accommodated, is provided. But in this unit plan, you are also describing specific ways in which this unit is differentiated for all students and for students with particular learning and language needs. Coming down to the resources section, this should be clear. The resources that are used for teaching and for students to access should be clearly identified along with descriptions so that it's very clear in identifying the curriculum. Any teacher could look across at some other teacher's unit and see the resources that were used. And then we come to the reflection section. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the main thing is that it's practical and thoughtful and thorough, and it's helpful for you, the current teacher, or not you, you're the coordinator, but for your teachers to think about their unit in terms of, in the prior to teaching the unit section, what do they need to do in the unit to support students? And what are they thinking about? Maybe this particular unit plan doesn't have a specific IB learner profile section as some unit plans do. So they're really giving it some thought. How are we going to support those attributes during the unit? How might we support services action? How might we be supporting the IB mission statement? So things that maybe are not always thought about in all units. The teacher has really given it some thought. Then during teaching, these are also very practical. How are students responding to the unit? How might we be needing to adapt the unit as we move on? How might we change the unit next time? So they're thinking about student progress in the objectives. And then in the after teaching the unit, a great topic to be discussing and thinking about here is assessment. What is it showing you? What do we need to do differently? How did they respond to the conceptual understanding? Were they able to demonstrate their understanding of the statement of inquiry and those ideas? Okay, so that's the unit in a nutshell. And now we're going to look at the specific questions that some of you entered into the question document, just to make sure that all of those have been covered. Some of them were already answered in the description of the sample unit plan, but let's just take a look at those real quick. So here's the question document. And let's see, we have a statement of inquiry question. Is there a formula that must be followed for the statement of inquiry? We did go over that quite extensively. And we made the point that the strict following of a formula is not really the way to go, but there are elements that need to be included. So I think that we have answered that question. The inquiry questions. In addition to inquiry questions based on key and related concepts and global context, can the teacher and students generate questions more specific to the skills in the unit to be added? Yes, we did touch on that briefly. But those types of skills and content-based questions definitely are encouraged, both the teacher and student-generated questions, and those questions can be entered in the learning process section of the unit plan. I did want to go back to the unit plan and show you an example of the type of content or skills-based questions that can be added. So a good example might be this. The inquiry question is here. How can teammates work together to help the whole team adapt to change? But there are some more specific questions that are not identified up in the inquiry section of the unit plan, but they're added into this section. So what elements of change during gameplay does a player need to watch out for? So that's going to be very specific to the skills and content of the unit. Another one, what does a player need to pay attention to in order to know how to adapt to those changes? So in this case, these more content specific questions still have the concepts within them. That might not be the case. They will help students understand the relevant inquiry question, but they might not have the concepts in them. These two questions do. However, this one, to what extent did it help you be more aware by pre-thinking specific things you needed to pay attention to in specific gameplay situations? So that doesn't really have any of the unit's concepts or context within it, but it does help students unpack and understand this inquiry question more specifically in terms of the content. The next question, should the inquiry questions be more broad or more subject specific? So it kind of depends on the statement of inquiry. As we discussed, some of those statements of inquiry might only be transferable within the subject or discipline. Then the inquiry questions are going to look more subject specific, but they are not going to include content. Then another question about the MYP objectives. Should a unit provide opportunities to address all objectives in all 4 criteria? This is a more complicated answer, but no, it doesn't have to address all objective strands. I'm assuming that's what this means. All objective strands of all objectives, or all criterion strands of all criteria. No, it doesn't need to in a single unit. In the early years of the program, you're probably going to be addressing fewer objectives and assessing fewer criteria strands. And then as students progress through the program, you're going to be adding on objective strands or criteria strands, so that by the end of the program, hopefully you're doing a holistic assessment of all strands of all criteria in at least one of the units. But some subjects have a requirement. For example, in design, each year teachers need to include one design project, and that's going to be addressing all strands of all objectives and being assessed with all strands of all criteria. In the arts, the 4 arts objectives work holistically together, and so the more strands of the end objectives that you can address in a unit, the better, but it's not a requirement. And again, if the unit is short, you're going to have fewer objectives and assess with fewer criteria. And in the early years of the program, you're going to have fewer. So let's see, is the objective section specifically for the summative assessment, or is it for all formative and summative assessment in the unit? Well, the objectives, if they are summatively assessed, you are going to give formative feedback in the progress in those same objectives. So whatever objectives and objective strands you're going to summatively assess, you're also going to be providing formative informal feedback and formative tasks that provide students with feedback in those same objectives or criteria strands. On this question, should a unit provide opportunities to assess all strands of a criterion? I think that it's the same question as here. So I think we have answered that already. Approaches to learning. Is it necessary to include ATL skill indicators in this section? Yes, it is, and we've shown some other elements that it's very important to describe in that ATL section about how those ATL skill indicators are taught, and I suggest also identifying the skill strategies that are taught. Should there be an ATL skill for each of the assessed criterion strands? There does not have to be. You know where your students are at and what criterion strands they need to be supported in ATL skills. So again, it would depend how many criteria and criteria strands you're assessing and what your students need. So there's no requirement that there needs to be an ATL skill identified for each assessed criterion strand. Then the question about the learning experiences and teaching strategies, how detailed does this have to be? I showed you one example, and that can be organized in a number of different types of sequential ways, but it needs to be detailed enough to clearly provide an outline of what students do over the course of the unit and the order in which teaching and learning occurs. Ooh, this is a big question. Differentiation. How do we differentiate instruction with distance learning? Unfortunately, we can't really get into that in this particular session. It's a tough one. It would be similar methods in terms of content, process, and product. But again, there's going to be a whole range of different approaches during distance learning. But we're not going to get to that here. And we've come to the end. So we'll just do a quick final reflection. So just think for yourself, to what extent has your understanding of MYP unit planning grown? Just a little, some, a lot? Just take note of that and take a deep breath. And be sure to take note of any ahas or further questions that you might have. I'll put my email address on here at the final slide if you have any further questions or clarifications. And just thank you so much for joining this session, and be safe, be well, take good care, and good luck with everything, and in particular your support of your teachers in unit planning during this very unpredictable time. So take care, stay safe.